What I thought I'd try to do today was talk a little bit about the Paris Agreement, and then hopefully have a bunch of time to have a conversation with you all and answer your questions. So that's what we'll do here. So taking me back to last December, to the Sunday morning after the agreement had been signed, after a blur of sleepless nights in La Bourget, Paris, in this refashioned airplane hangar where COP21 was held. I remember very vividly running to the actual airport to catch my plane back to the United States, and there being a blur of headlines on cable news as I was going. And the headlines were characterizing this agreement that had just been inked as historic and unprecedented, and then at the same time, headlines saying insufficient, inconclusive. And in the months since, as we returned to the US and we've begun the process of implementation, I've been pressed repeatedly to defend the agreement against these seemingly contradictory conclusions. So what I'd like to try to argue today is that both descriptions are right, that the Paris Agreement is simultaneously humanity's best chance to save the planet, and it is also on its own wholly insufficient to solve the climate threat. So if that's right, then I'd like to talk a little bit about my sense of what should matter most for international climate policy in the years ahead. So, but before we get that, just a few words on what Paris is. We talk about Paris a lot. What is it actually? So at its core, it is an agreement adopted by all 195 countries to the UNFCCC. The United Nations Convention on Climate Change. And it directs all nations to set their own climate policies. The countries set their own targets. Those are known as INDCs, Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. Those commitments are for the period 2020 to 2030. The agreement then legally obligates countries to update those plans every 5 years, to provide emissions inventories of their national emissions profile, to report regularly on progress to those targets, and to subject those reports to independent review. And finally, the agreement affirms the need for increasing resources to flow to developing countries for low carbon development and climate adaptation. So that's it. That's Paris. So what makes that historic? I would point to three things. The first is that Paris actually reflects a universal commitment by all countries to put forward increasingly ambitious climate targets. And I think for students of climate diplomacy, several of whom are in this room and have been doing this a lot longer than I have, this is a truly big deal. In the period from Rio in 1992 to Kyoto in 97 and the decade or more that followed, the dominant theory of climate change diplomacy was not one of universality, but one of bifurcation between countries. Countries put in a developed country bucket were required to enact major emissions reductions, and then countries that were put in a developing country bucket were largely off the hook in response in part to what people saw as a far-off environmental problem. And over time, the severity of the problem increased, the global economy transformed with the rise of China and emerging economies, but this model persisted. And in 2009, it proved completely unworkable. Politically, it was unsaleable to treat a country like China as equivalent to a country like Chad, or a country like Korea, whose GDP per capita is now higher than Italy, the same as a country like Kiribati, who on lots of projections will be the first nation to actually no longer exist because of rising sea levels. So politically it didn't work, but mathematically it was also untenable to try to solve the problem of global climate change when developed countries themselves represent less than a third of global emissions. So even if you had the United States, the EU, Japan, other countries literally go carbon neutral overnight, you still had developing countries representing 2/3 or more of emissions that were left out of that system. So in 2009, there was Copenhagen, largely viewed as a failure. But in that failure, there were the seeds of a new answer and a new model. And after decades of trial and error, they were happening on this new approach, an approach that wouldn't abandon this core idea of common but differentiated responsibilities, CDBR, the now mythic idea. But the basic idea that poorer countries will be treated differently than richer ones. But for the first time, every country universally would set climate targets. They wouldn't be mandated from above, but the Paris Agreement, and this is important, did legally bind all countries to update those targets, to report against them, and all countries pledged to make them stronger over time. So if you look at the landscape, some countries' initial INDCs are very ambitious, others were more conservative, some were more detailed, and some were more speculative. But all countries bought into this basic idea that universal action, not bifurcated action, was required. All countries committed to a global system to increasing ambition. And that really was historic. So number two, and this one I think is the one that I find the most interesting. The Paris Agreement reflects our best opportunity to actually move beyond what has been a long accepted economic principle, that there's a zero-sum trade-off between economic growth and reducing emissions. For decades, we've been in a situation where global GDP growth and carbon pollution from the energy sector have been rising in tandem. Countries accepted this, and the negotiations presumed that to restrict the latter, emissions, you had to sacrifice some of the former, growth. But recently, something very important has happened. Over the past 2 years that we have data, the global economy has grown 6.7%. And during that period, energy sector emissions have stayed flat. That is the first time outside of a global downturn when the global economic growth has decoupled from emissions growth. In the United States, during the same period, GDP has grown by 11%, while energy sector emissions have fallen by 3%. There was a recent study by WRI that showed that this dynamic is actually now present in more than 20 countries, including some countries that you wouldn't expect, like Bulgaria or Uzbekistan, where the industrial sectors are still expanding as a share of their economy. So even in a developing circumstance, you're still seeing decoupling of growth from emissions in the energy sector. There are other studies that have suggested that even China, whose growth, at least reported growth, was 6.9% in 2015, may be close to peaking its emissions already. Of course, in a country like India, where they have 300 million citizens lacking access to electricity, poverty alleviation must and will continue to be the priority. But the basic idea that meeting development imperatives requires unconstrained emissions growth is being actively disproven in the Paris context. Indeed, Prime Minister Modi himself argued passionately in the context of the negotiations leading into Paris that it is actually the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations that will be the most adversely affected by climate change. And it's those governments that will bear the disproportionate effect of rising emissions. That's why India is now trying to drive massive solar deployment in its power sector. And if they succeed, that actually has the prospect of putting them on a low-carbon growth path as well, to decoupling in a reasonable horizon. So to be clear, the Paris Agreement is not responsible for, responsible for this broader economic dynamic. But I think that this point is very important. A group of researchers at MIT recently took all of the INDCs, all of the country commitments in Paris, and said, if we believe that they are implemented, what would it mean? They found that fulfilling them will require an additional 2,000 gigawatts of deployed renewable electricity capacity. That's the country's commitments themselves. If the world deploys an additional 2,000 gigawatts of renewable capacity, that scale will drive down costs. They estimate a 50% reduction in the cost of solar, a 25% reduction in the cost of wind, and those are global prices. If that happens, then we are going to be in a situation where renewables globally, by 2030, by the end of the Paris implementation period, will be cheaper than both coal and natural gas. So the Paris Agreement, the commitments embedded there, could get us to a place where this idea of decoupling economic growth from emissions growth becomes a reality across the global economy. And the fact that that moment is within sight, within a relevant time period, is also historic. Third point is, and this is more of a political point, which is that Paris reflects the world's largest economies and the largest emitters moving from a position of climate laggards to a position of climate leaders. I'm obviously the most close to President Obama's transformation in this respect. And in the ashes of Copenhagen, in the wake of the frenzy that happened in that meeting, he resolved to reposition the United States as a leader on climate change. So that meant first domestically leading by example. And so when you think about the President's Climate Action Plan, the Clean Power Plan, fuel economy standards, phasing down HFCs, building in appliance standards across the board, they all are important domestically, but they're all part of a larger strategy to actually demonstrate to the world that the United States could actually set and then start moving toward hitting ambitious emissions reduction goals. But the President also realized, in part shaped by his experience in Copenhagen, that to create a new environment, to find a new consensus towards a universal approach, we would need to forge new bilateral partnerships as well, what Josh was giving me a hard time about earlier. And that's why, if you think about the last several years, slow, deliberate, but intentional, the President stood with Prime Minister Modi in New Delhi to announce India's ambitious solar targets that I just mentioned. He negotiated a joint clean energy action plan with President Peña Nieto from Mexico. He announced renewable energy goals with Brazil, more ambitious than ever before. He met with leaders from African nations, from island states, the Middle East, everywhere in between, to reinforce his commitment and to encourage others to climate action. And most famously, in late 2014, he stood with President Xi in Beijing and surprised the world. To that point, China and the United States, the two largest economies, the two largest emitters, we have a complex relationship on a range of issues. And on climate, it had seemed that for decades we had been captains of two opposing teams. But over years, dogged, sustained work and diplomacy actually led our two countries, working behind the scenes privately, to get a better sense of what each country could do to reduce emissions. And we were able to encourage and reinforce each other. And that led to the 2014 joint announcement of historic emissions targets by both countries. It also led the next year, in September of last year, to the joint announcement of ambitious implementation plans and a roadmap, a vision for what the Paris Agreement would look like. If you go back to that vision that was released in September of 2015, about 3 months before Paris, I remember rolling out that agreement when President Xi was at the White House. And there was a lot of focus on their respective domestic implementation announcements. In particular, China had announced that it would implement a domestic cap-and-trade program in 2017. And our domestic press found it quite interesting politically that after our failure on cap-and-trade, that the Chinese would come and announce cap-and-trade. But I kept trying to say to people, you should look at this roadmap to Paris. You should look at what we agreed to. The press found it hard to digest at that point. And part of it is because it was written in more for climate negotiators than for the broad public. But if you go back and you look at that roadmap that we put out in September, and then you look at the Paris Agreement, I think what you'll see is an arc that reflected the impact of the two largest economies and emitters helping to try to lay the groundwork in a deliberate way. So that partnership, the partnerships with other major economies, it wasn't just helpful in getting Paris over the finish line. It also has re-scrambled the traditional political dynamics and coalitions. And it's created new potential global coalitions on climate change that didn't exist. And I think that's truly historic as well. So we've got a universal agreement, no longer bifurcated. We've got one that holds out the prospect that we could actually move beyond a zero-sum growth and climate trade-off. And we've got new global politics going on. It all feels pretty great. But it is not at all the whole story. And this is the uncertain and insufficient part of Paris. As you all know, and as climate scientists have been telling us for years, we've been training our sight on 2 degrees. Can we limit the increase in global temperatures by the end of the century to 2 degrees Celsius? But even at 2 degrees, it is an arresting picture. 30% reduction in crop yields globally. An increase by 8 times by the amount of the American West that's subject to wildfires. A decrease in the Arctic Sea ice coverage by 50%. That's all at 2 degrees. So that's why Paris itself called on countries to make their best efforts to limit warming to even further, to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if you step back and you ask, how much does the Paris Agreement alone make? How much progress does it make in actually getting to those targets? The answer is not nearly enough. Science recently published what I think is probably the most helpful probabilistic assessment, fair assessment of the INDCs itself. What they found was that without Paris, there's no chance of limiting to 2 degrees. And there's at least a 50% chance that warming will increase by 4 degrees or more. So they then assume the Paris INDCs are implemented and that they continue through the end of the century. So at that point, you get to an 8% chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees. Good news, you do cut the tail risk down. So the risk that warming increases by more than 4 degrees, if the INDCs are implemented, drops to close to 0. And that is quite significant. But the idea of leaving my 2 children or their children with a 92% chance that the most severe impacts of climate change are going to happen is anything but comforting. So the agreement does direct countries to increase their ambition over time in 5-year increments. So the model looked at that too, and they estimated that if countries increase their ambition, then we get up to a 30% chance of limiting warming to below 2 degrees. But if renewable energy costs drop dramatically, if deployment increases more rapidly, if technological innovation accelerates, if forest carbon sinks continue to mitigate emissions, the probability of limiting warming to 2 degrees rises to 50%. So I'll be the first to acknowledge that that's just 50%, and there were a lot of ifs in the statement that I just made. And that's where we find ourselves today. And I hope that I've convinced you, and I certainly feel myself, that that should give you concrete reason for both optimism, but a lot of uncertainty as well. So what do we do with these conflicting impulses? And what should be the most important in this post-Paris era? I would argue 3 specific goals. The first is we have to make the mechanics of the Paris Agreement more concrete. Because if Paris is a bet, a calculated bet, that a universal, bottom-up global system can actually generate more ambition over time, then we all need to sweat the specifics of that process. If the system is going to drive reforms and encourage more action, then the particulars of what and when and how countries engage in things like inventories and reporting, or how carbon markets are developed, they take on outsized importance. So let me give you just one relatively timely example. While the formal Paris implementation period in the UNFCCC structure is 2020 to 2030, the Paris Agreement itself could actually go into effect far sooner than that. There is a little notice provision in the agreement, and it says that as soon as 55 countries representing at least 55% of emissions formally join, then the agreement will enter into force. Notably, up until the final version of the agreement, that clause had said 55 countries, 55% of emissions, but not before 2020. In the final agreement, that final clause fell away, which creates substantial opportunity. Because if Paris enters into force early, it will have a catalytic effect. It will create more time to resolve key negotiating issues sooner. It will encourage swifter implementation of domestic reforms. The machine will turn more quickly. So that's why just 2 weeks ago, President Obama and President Xi stood together again in Washington and announced that both countries would not just sign the Paris Agreement, but would officially join the agreement as soon as possible, but no later than the end of 2016. The United States and China together represent somewhere between 38 and 39% of emissions. So we're getting there. Last week, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China together, the basics, they committed to, quote, facilitate the timely entry into force of the agreement and urged other countries to do so as well. So already, before April 22nd, the event that will happen next week at the UN, where more than 130 countries will come and sign the agreement, already we have concrete signals that we are in striking distance of having this agreement be joined and ratified and entered into force far earlier than anyone anticipated. So if you're invested in addressing the uncertainty and the insufficiency of Paris, this is an opportunity to make progress that people didn't think was possible. Second, we've got to lock in even more climate ambition now. If you believe, if you buy my case, then you should weigh heavily any domestic action that can happen sooner rather than later. By 2020, many countries, including the United States, will be required to put forward new targets for the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. And before that happens, all countries are required, based on a global stocktake of emissions that will happen in 2018, to signal how they are going to meet their 2020 targets. If they are more ambitious in getting to 2020, they'll be better positioned to set more aggressive targets for 2030. The baseline will be more amenable. And the story since Paris is a positive one. We're making progress on this front. In the United States in December, in fact, only days after the president got off the plane from Paris, he went into negotiations with congressional leadership to try to secure a long-term extension of tax credits for wind and solar. These tax credits were not assumed or baked into our INDCs, to our climate targets. But after Paris and subsequent to those, we were able to enact into law targets that NREL suggests will add an additional 100 gigawatts of renewable capacity over the next 5 years, between now and 2020, and that will cut our carbon emissions by additional 2% by 2020 as well. In January, the president, after that, stood up at the State of the Union and announced that the Department of Interior would pause new coal leases on all federal land, and that we would launch a fundamental review of the coal program, which hasn't happened in more than a generation, and now accounts for 40% of the United States coal supply. Outside of the United States, in the period since Paris, we've also seen movement. The historic deployment of renewables in 2015 has accelerated in the first quarter of 2016. This has included actions in China, in the Middle East, and Africa. And one other specific example. Following the Paris Agreement as well, in Mexico, President Peña Nieto went home and passed a national clean energy standard, requiring 35% of the country's generation to come from clean energy by 2024. That's 35% up from 18% today. Again, that happened after Paris and after the submission of the INDCs. So this kind of progress before the Paris implementation period, it boosts baselines. If we boost baselines, and we have 5 years before the official Paris implementation period, we have a better launching pad. We have more grounds from which to argue, make the political argument, as well as the economic argument, that countries should reach further and should do more. So the last thing that I would argue we should care a lot about is we should care about the durability of the long-term market signal toward investments in low-carbon development. I remember before I got on the plane to go to Paris with the president on the front end of the Paris conference, we had a very strange setup because of the PTSD that all of the leaders had about Copenhagen when all the leaders came at the end. That this time all the leaders were going to come at the beginning. So we got on the plane and flew with the president to go to the beginning, and then all the leaders left, and everybody looked at each other and said, okay, now what? But before we got on the plane, I remember a prominent journalist, a prominent US journalist who I won't mention, he suggested to me that the details didn't matter. Irrespective of the details, just getting an agreement would end up being the most powerful market signal to the private sector to invest in clean energy that had ever happened. So, as I hope you've figured out by now, I actually tend to sweat the details. But in this instance, the point was actually important. Because for me, one of the most striking things about the process that led into Paris last year was the American private sector's near unanimous view that a long-term international climate framework was actually in their business interest. Different companies make different decisions about how vocal they are about that point, but it is very difficult to find credible private sector voices that would argue against the utility of having a global climate framework. And it's also why the vocal coalition in Paris was actually much more than just those 105 nation states. It was, in very real terms, Walmart and Google and Amazon. It was Alcoa and Ford and DuPont. It was also investors like Jack Ma and John Doerr and Ratan Tata, Richard Branson. It was Tom Steyer and Meg Whitman together, which for you West Coasters should be something. We need to do everything we can to make that market signal an enduring and irreversible force. There are lots of ways to do that, but let me just raise another seemingly technical one. One way to do that is to give the private sector more certainty about what the clean energy future could look like. There's another seemingly bureaucratic clause in the Paris Agreement, and it invited countries to not just submit INDCs on a 5-year period, but to actually lay out mid-century strategies toward deep decarbonization. It basically said, as you're doing your 5-year plans, give us a vision, give us a roadmap for how you get to a 1.5 scenario, how you get to truly decarbonizing your economy by the middle of the century. Now, given the uncertainties of projecting 30 or 40 years into the future, this is an inherently speculative modeling exercise. It's not going to project or lock countries into specific policies. It's not the INDC process. Rather, it can define pathways for action. It can provide a roadmap for investment opportunities. It can provide crucial modeling capacity for developing countries who want to get on that path to actually demonstrate and work with their private sectors on how to do it. All of that can reinforce the market signal. Again, last month, President Obama and this time President Trudeau announced that both countries will not only undertake those mid-century strategies, but will complete them by the end of this year. That was also a detail that did not get as much attention during the Canadian state visit. It was hard to get that much attention when we had the most famous Justin in Canadian history coming to the United States. But this issue of mid-century strategies will be a core topic when countries gather on April 22nd. It will be a core topic at the Major Economies Forum that we are hosting the following weekend. And if it's taken seriously, it creates another important opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to identify where we all respectively need to up our game, and that will be true for the United States as well. And as we give the private sector a clearer vision of what a decarbonized economy could look like and a more certain sense of where major investment opportunities exist, then they will be willing to take more risk and invest in clean energy and accelerate that process. And again, if you care about trying to reduce that uncertainty and increase the ambition of the Paris framework, that is also an important component of the strategy. So I hope with that I have done enough to convince you to be at least a little bit motivated and at least a little bit scared by the prospect of the Paris Agreement. I am motivated because we saw the world come together in a way that it never had around a universal agreement. We are seeing more progress than we ever have at decoupling economic growth from emissions. And we are seeing the beginnings of new political coalitions around climate change. And I am scared because the agreement is insufficient and we are not catching up to the science. And of all of the issues that we work on and all of the policy issues that come across a president's desk, the president has said this to us, to his team on multiple occasions, that on issues that he cares deeply about, like education or middle-class incomes or criminal justice reform, you work and you work and you work, and each generation has work to do, and it feels halting and it feels slow and it feels insufficient, but you have a sense that you're moving in the right direction and that things can improve if you work at it. Climate is different, and that there is not only such a thing as being too late, but that moment is quickly approaching us. So we all should come at this with a sense of agitation and a sense of urgency that leads us to look for every creative opportunity to try to lock in the gains that we've seen and build off them going forward. I will just add with saying, with trying to translate, that for all the cynicism out there and all those headlines of negativity, I did see in that room, as the agreement was gavelled through, an incredible sense of hope among the hundreds of climate diplomats in the room. And as many of you know, hope is not usually something that is that abounds in crowds of climate diplomats. And it was a moment to be celebrated, but it is a moment to build on. And whether the Paris Agreement ultimately lives up to that hope, it depends on what happens going forward. And I will just leave you with a note that President Obama wrote on a copy of the agreement. He came back to thank the negotiating team, and he signed a copy of the agreement. And he wrote, quote, "You've given future generations a fighting chance." And I think that that's a reasonable summation of what we did. It makes me more motivated than ever to keep waging the fight, and that's what we'll keep doing with every moment we have left in office. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and now let's have a conversation. I'll take your questions.